This morning, for all of you that are sleeping at home still, hopefully you'll watch this later. Spring forward. It is not 9 o'clock, it is actually 10 o'clock. All right. Remember, from last week, and actually we've done this for a few weeks now, we're going to be talking about the trumpets number 5 and 6. The seals were before the trumpets. The 7 seals do not come before the 7 trumpets. Instead, like we said several times before, they run concurrently. They are both both the seals and the trumpets are dealing with exactly the same period of time. That is from the death and resurrection of Jesus until he returns. The 7 seals, we said, focus on both the judgment of the unbelievers as well at the same time as the purification of the believers. On the other hand, the trumpets concentrate more almost solely on the various judgments on unbelievers. This is the same time period for each with a different emphasis. These last 3 trumpets, trumpets 5, 6, and 7, are set apart from the first 3 by the 3 woes that we saw in chapter 8, verse 13. Okay, so trumpet number 5. When the 5th trumpet sounded, John sees another vision of judgment. It says, Revelation chapter 9, verse 1, a star from heaven which had fallen to the earth. That's what he sees. The imagery for what John sees comes from such places as Joel and Isaiah and Exodus and Deuteronomy and Jeremiah. It comes from all over the Bible. But probably the blessed place we could look at is actually in Luke chapter 10, verse 18, where Jesus uses the same kind of language when he says, I was watching Satan fall from heaven like lightning. Therefore, some think that this is Satan himself. Could be. Others believe that this could just as easily be one of Satan's trusted followers. Several clues suggest that we know that this angel/star of evil was actually evil. It fell. It does not do any things by its own power. He was given the power, or the key as it says, at times to unleash evil. Plus, when the key is used, it brought forth evil. And on top of that, by the time we get to verse 11, we find that his name is Destroyer. All of these things point to the fact that we have a very evil personality, and that it is also either Satan or one of Satan's very trusted angels. This fallen angel is given the role of inflicting punishment on sinful humanity. He is given the key to the bottomless pit, but ultimately his authority is given by Christ. This same imagery will show up again when we get to Revelation chapter 20. The opening of the abyss here in chapter 9 results in the oppression of unbelievers unbelievers who do not have the seal of God, whereas the closing of the abyss in chapter 20 results in the protection of those who have God's seal. So sometimes, like we've said before, Revelation is long range. We see the opening of one thing in one part of the book and a closing of the similar thing or the same thing in another part of the book, and for different reasons. And that's what's going to be going on here. But this first passage in chapter 9 focuses on those who Satan is able to deceive, while in the second passage up in chapter 20 that we'll get to later, we will see the restraints are placed on his ability to deceive those believers. As both of these visions unfold, one thing that is clearly seen is the sovereignty of God and of the Lamb. As Revelation progresses, we are supposed to understand that the Father and Son have authority over everything. That's one thing that Revelation should be pounding and pounding and pounding into your head as you read it. And that includes Satan and his angels. It is important for believers to remember this when the forces of evil direct their wrath in ways that seem to overpower. Christians need always to remember that there is a grand purpose and there is a plan through which God is working, no matter how bad things seem to get. We see smoke that rises from the abyss when it is opened. Chapter 9, verse 2 tells us that the sun and the air were darkened by the smoke of the pit. Like we said, similar words have already been used in the book, such as Revelation chapter 6, verse 12, in the opening of the sixth seal. The sun became black, etc. The moon was like blood. And in Revelation chapter 8, which we've already looked at, when the fourth trumpet was sounded, we're told that the sun and the moon and the stars were darkened. This imagery is an allusion to the darkening of the sun found several times in the book of Joel, especially in chapter 2. But like many of the images we see in the trumpet judgments, it is ultimately a pattern that is after the plagues of Egypt in Exodus, where God caused a deep darkness. I believe ever since Genesis chapter 3, when God told Satan that his seed and the seed of the woman would ultimately clash, and that the woman's seed would crush his head, that Satan continued over that whole period of time to try and foil any plan that could possibly lead to the woman's promised descendant. And of course, we know on this side of it that that descendant that was promised was from the seed of David, from the seed of Abraham, and it was Christ. But no one knew that, not even the devil. I believe that he did not know who was coming, so he kind of threw his forces willy-nilly as much as he could to try to stop whatever it is that would happen. And he did it in a lot of different ways. He tried during the time of Cain and Abel. Abel was killed, and Seth's seed took over. As the promised seed, he was actually the true one. Noah was the last man standing. Evil was on the earth, and Noah could have been influenced if God didn't kind of step in and remember Noah. Isaac was Abraham's son of old age, and I think Satan was hoping that Abraham would die first. He might have even been toying with Satan for all we know. And of course, there was the sacrifice in which ultimately Abraham's hand was stayed. Israel was placed into bondage under Egypt, and his children were killed. But still, time after time after time after time, as many times in the Bible as there are places where the promised seed could have been wiped out, God overtook the situation and made sure that the seed survived until Christ could come. All through the Old Testament, we see examples of how Satan tried to truncate the lineage leading to the promised seed. But like everyone else, Satan did not know who this son would be or when exactly he would come. That was the best kept secret. I think that's one of the reasons why Daniel was told, it's not time for you to know. And God wasn't going to tip his hand so that Satan knew. And every time Satan tried to do this, God prevented him from doing so. Thus, when Jesus finally did come on the scene, it was Jesus that became the new target. But again, God's strategy was foolproof. Ultimately, the death of the promised son was the very trigger that completed the plan. That's important to see. I don't think we often see that. What Satan thought was going to happen was if he could kill the promised seed or some link in it along the way, that he could kill the plan. But the plan was for the promised seed to be killed. So by doing that, Satan played right into God's hands. Can you imagine how furious Satan was when he found this out? I think what we could be seeing here in these verses is the aftermath of this Satan fury. But it is regulated. Why? Because he is not the one in control. Satan is again playing into God's hands. His power is being both limited and manipulated by the very one he is trying to defeat. And so we see God using Satan both to refine the hearts of believers, as we saw in the seals, and to help impose condemnation on those that refuse to believe. See how God uses whatever forces he has to his own good? We think that things are bad. God's orchestrating, okay? He's like the great conductor. He knows how to make things work out the way they need to be. The demonic beings that are used by God to help separate these two groups are portrayed in this group of passages here as locusts rising from a smoking abyss. Like the original plague of locusts found in Exodus, it is God himself who sends them throughout the earth. Notice that they are evil. They are being sent by an evil person, either the devil or an angel of the devil. But God is the one that's doing the sending, just like he sent the locusts the first time, back in Exodus. Notice the wording in these verses. For instance, they were given power. They were told not to harm. They were allowed to torment. God is doing the allowing. God is doing the telling. God is giving them that power, limiting it, telling them what they can and cannot do. They did not have the power or the ability to do whatever it is that they want. In fact, Beale states that the phrase power was given them actually implies that it is God or Christ who is the subject. The idea is that it is God who was absolutely what has absolute sovereignty over the instruments he decides to use for his purposes. We are told in verse 2 that the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke coming from the pit. This image is in various parts of various parts of heaven, like the sun and the moon and the stars. Becoming dark has already been used in Revelation chapter 6 and 8, like we just mentioned. This is an allusion to Joel chapter 2, chapter 3, and Isaiah chapter 13, and other places in the Old Testament. But originally, this was one of the judgments on Egypt because of the hardness of Pharaoh's heart. This is no reason to think that anything has changed here in Revelation. I mean, God is showing us in the symbolism that he's using pretty much the same kinds of methods. Back then he uses physical methods to do that. But in here, he's showing us symbolically he's doing basically the same thing. Now keep in mind also that the darkness throughout the New Testament also symbolizes spiritual blindness in places like John chapter 8, verse 12, where Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have light of life. And Paul says in 2 Corinthians, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ who is the image of God. What John is witnessing here in Revelation is not a new phenomena. Like Solomon said, there is nothing new under the sun. The same principles and imageries that God used to deal with these believers and unbelievers in the Old Testament are still being used throughout Revelation. Exactly the same terminologies, exactly the same symbolisms. So, when they are used, we are to pay attention to the details. And here are a couple of the details. For instance, in Exodus, the locusts were supposed to, the locust harmed the vegetation, the trees and the plants and etc. Why did they do that? Because they were real locusts. All right? But in Revelation chapter 9, verse 4, the locusts are told not to harm grass or the trees. Why? Because they're not real locusts. All right? Instead, they are to harm only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. They're kind of like the Passover locusts. All right? They look for the mark, and some of them, they're marked by God. They're sealed by God. They don't harm them. if they have the seal of Satan, they can do that. So in a way, like I said, they're Passover locusts. God's people are portrayed as having God's stamp of ownership, as we will see later, Satan's people will also have a mark of their own. So, what is the purpose of these locusts? We see in a couple places here, verse 5 says that they were permitted to kill anyone, but only to, were not permitted to kill anyone, but only to torment those people for 5 months. And in verse 6 it says that men will seek death and will not find it. Some say that the 5 months is literal and actually is kind of the period associated with the lifespans of a locust. But these are not real locusts, all right? So I'm not sure that that is the best way to interpret that. I think that the idea that's being talked about here is spiritual and mental rather than physical. These locusts are used to cause events which remind the ungodly that they are separated from God. Such reminders should and do cause despair among people, despair when people are forced to reflect on their hopeless situation. And just as Israel was protected from the plagues of Egypt, so too Christians' spiritual well-being is protected because of their faith in God and His seal. So, a couple of what I think would be fairly decent examples would be, number one, a guy named Friedrich Nietzsche. Anybody remember who he is? Studying him in philosophy class. I'm going to tell you a couple things about him that they don't say. Nietzsche was the one that is attributed as saying that God is dead, and his writings and works were liberating for those who wished to defy the creator of the universe. But at the end of his life, what they don't tell you is Nietzsche went crazy and was institutionalized. Now, they will say when you bring that up that it's because he had some kind of venereal disease, which probably is true. But what also happened was that he would stand on his bed in the insane asylum quoting Bible scriptures that was taught to him by his mother when he was a boy. Talk about torment. This may be an extreme case of what this passage is alluding to. Torment that is primarily spiritual and psychological suffering. And this could explain why the sealed believers are not affected. They have confidence in their destiny. For instance, Psalm chapter 23, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Or in Philippians, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. The catastrophes of life are all under the control of a sovereign God. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, we see that Israel is told about their blessings of if they believe and obey God, and the curses if they don't and they're disobedient. Among those curses are madness and confusion of mind. Another man, and some of you have met him, I know. I have more than once and talked to him personally, John Clayton. And if you remember a little bit about him, those of you that don't remember, I'll tell you that he worked for Madeline O'Hare. He was part of the organization that tried to take God out of school and tried to take the In God We Trust off the dollar bill. He was Madeline O'Hare's right-hand man. If you have never heard him tell the story of his conversion, get online, look up doesgodexist.org, and it will be there somewhere, either in print or possibly a video of it. It is an incredible story of what he went through. Yes. John Clayton tells of his internal turmoil as he struggles with his belief as an atheist, and how this internal struggle helped to finally make him realize that God really did exist. Just like Pharaoh and the Egyptians, all plagues are sent by God. All plagues sent by God are ultimately meant to either change men's minds or to judge them as hardened and therefore guilty. And here we've seen two extremes. The story of John Clayton is incredible. The story of Friedrich Nietzsche is sad. At the end of this section, we are told that the angel in charge of these locust demons is called Destroyer. The Greek and the Hebrew names together with the statement that this angel is king over the demons suggests that it, like we said before, it is either Satan himself or his most powerful representative. The details are we are told, are descriptions of the locusts. And what's used a lot in these descriptions is the word like. All right? There's a bunch of them. They are like horses prepared for battle. Their teeth are like the teeth of lions. Their breastplates are like iron. And you see a bunch more up there. It tells over and over and over again what these locusts are like. These descriptions all come from various places in the book of Joel. I never knew that. That's kind of cool. These are not things that John's just making up off the top of his head while he's writing this and because of what he sees. He's also writing what it is he remembers because he knew the Old Testament very, very well. Like we have emphasized many times before, these locusts must be understood figuratively. They are symbolic. Trumpet number 6. Back in chapter 6, when the fifth seal was opened, we heard a loud cries of the saints. And do you remember what it was that they said?
How long?
Exactly. How long? Very good. I got, what was that, 3 answers? Good answers. How long? Okay? God hasn't forgotten this. He's building as we go in this book. Their cries came from under the altar, if you remember. Also, when we move to chapter 8 and the 7th seal was opened, an angel mixed incense with those prayers of the saints. It says that the angel did this on the golden altar, all right, throughout that verse. The manner in which these passages are laid out and identified shows that they are speaking to the same problem. Therefore, when we hear that the voices come from the four horns of the golden altar, it is an indication that it comes next. It is an indication that what comes next is related to the petition of the saints that began back in chapter 6. In other words, this how long we just mentioned. Remember, this is not chronological. So as we said, the seals and the trumpets are speaking to the same time period from the death of and resurrection of Jesus until he returns. This time, we are told that the altar has 4 horns. In other words, it's giving us more clarification. It's giving us more detail. Remember that 4 is another one of these important numbers. Okay? Remember those symbolic numbers we've been talking about over and over again? 4 is also one of those. It is the number that shows the 4 corners of the earth, and it symbolizes the world or the creation itself. And horns are often symbols of power. Therefore, the golden altar now has 4 horns to show that the completeness of God's power is over his creation. In Revelation chapter 14, coming up later, we will see that the same altar is linked to the power over judgment when it says, another angel, the one who has power over fire, came out of the altar. Another thing we should notice here, I was supposed to show you that slide, sorry. Another thing we're supposed to see here is the word before. Now the word before, God, what does it say? That came from the 4 horns of the golden altar that are before God. The word before actually isn't the best word to use there. It actually should be translated more like in the presence of. So this should be that the voice was coming from the 4 horns of the golden altar that is before the presence of God. Before can mean that, but you just want to make sure that you understand that it does. This phrase, exact same phrase, is used 6 times in Revelation, in chapter 4, in chapter 5, in chapter 7, in chapter 8, in chapter 9, in chapter 11, and so on. It's used over and over and over again. And it is always used with the explicit reference to some aspect of God's presence in the heavenly temple. And on top of that, every time there is an implication of either judgment or protection from judgment associated with the response to prayers of the saints. It's a very specific and detailed, every time this is given, it's about the exact same thing. So we once you understand that, every time you see it, you know that that's what's happening. In verse 14, the voice told the 6th angel, release the 4 angels who are bound by the great river Euphrates. The idea of these 4 angels being bound implies they had been somehow restrained against their will up to this point. Just like the demons in the abyss in verses 1 through 3, sort of. The Euphrates, on the other hand, has a long, dark history in the Old Testament. Now, I'm going to go into a little bit of it here, but I'm going to try to go into it in a little more detail later on. But I'm going to give you a few hints as to what I'm talking about. If you think about Palestine or Canaan as being the center of God's place on earth, it is where Abraham went to. It is where Moses was eventually leading the people of God to. It is where Israel stayed until they were captured and taken away. From there, if you look at a map, and I'll try to do this later with a map, everything else in the Bible is pretty much to the east of that spot. Okay? So, east is important in the Bible. Adam and Eve were sent east when they were forced from the garden. The river Euphrates is always towards the east of Canaan in the Old Testament. Cain was forced even farther east after he killed his brother. Nimrod's kingdom, talked about in Genesis, included Babel, which became Babylon, and Assyria, which we find out later are both kingdoms that will persecute the Jewish people, and they were between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. They were over by the Euphrates in the east. The Tower of Babel was in the east, and Abraham fought kings of the east. If you remember from Genesis chapter, I can't remember right now. I can't remember. Yeah. Both the northern and the southern kingdoms were captured by nations that were in the east, Babylon and Assyria, which in turn were situated in the vicinity of the Euphrates. Sometimes Euphrates is, the river Euphrates is referenced as north, as it is in Jeremiah and Isaiah a couple of places. But more than that, it is understood to be east of God's place. When you go east, you go farther and farther towards evil. When you come from the east, evil is coming towards God's people. It's kind of a symbolism that runs throughout the entire Old Testament. In Revelation, Euphrates never refers to the literal place where the armies will come together and clash at this great battle. That's not the purpose of using the word Euphrates. It is this idea that it is always intended, set up by God, to be a symbol of the evil in the world. And that's how it's used here. Instead, the Euphrates was set up as a symbol throughout the entire Old Testament, so it could be used here in Revelation to depict the place where evil was sent and where evil comes from. The mention of the river Euphrates here in chapter 9 anticipates the battle that's going to come up in the sixth bowl later on. This is one way that we can know that the sixth trumpet and the sixth bowl describe the exact same event because of how they're associated this way, only from different perspectives. In the Old Testament, it was God that unleashed the invaders from the area of the Euphrates that captured and judged Israel. And here in Revelation, it is also Euphrates, this same symbolism used by John to show the unleashing of corrupt angelic invaders. Too often when people are teaching Revelation or discussing it or writing books on it, they use these places as physical places that, look, we got to look over here because something's happened around that river. The Revelation is coming true. That's not what it's talking about. It's not what it's talking about at all. Back in Revelation chapter 7, verse 1, we saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth so that no wind might blow on the earth. Here we see the one who controls the 4 corners of the earth, in other words, God, symbolized by the 4 horns of the golden altar, letting these forces go when the 6th angel blows its trumpet. Whether in the physical world or in the spiritual world, God has the authority and the power to contain or release whatever powers he sees fit for his purposes. These 4 angels had previously been bound and therefore had not been able to carry out their function. Of course, as it is every time, God is in control of it. And therefore, it is God that dictates the what, where, and when. This time, they are being allowed to kill 1/3 of mankind. I wondered a little bit about this 1/3. We've run into this already. I've found no commentators that says this. And how could this work in as being something other than, oh no, we're going to divide the earth up and 1/3 of it's going to... Remember the number 3, how important it was? I think it's could be as simple as the fact that he's divided it into 3 parts, and that number is important. All right? I think that might be all it's talking about. And it's a partial thing. That is true. But I think that's why 3 is chosen when we see this a lot. We see a 1/3 of this and a 1/3 of that. Just my thought. I just thought of it here about 3 weeks ago and been mulling it over. This time, they are being allowed to kill 1/3 of mankind. The size of this demonic army is said to be 200 million in many translations, but that's actually the wrong way to look at it, because the actual term is double myriad of myriads. And that myriad, or the Greek myrias, is used in reference to an innumerable number. And never in the Bible does this word refer to a specific number unless it's prefixed by a numerical adjective. So in other words, if it said 2 myriad, then it might be a more specific number. If it said 47 myriad, it might be a big number, but it means that particular number. But here it says double. That is not a specific numeric adjective, and so instead it refers to an uncountable number, is the way that needs to be interpreted. That makes it impossible to calculate. This shows that the number is symbolic and not literal, just like 144,000 and some of the other ones that we talked about. And here it is simply to be used to be understood as a vast, vast number. In the Old Testament, the high priest's breastplate was filled with colorful, precious stones, but in contrast here, we see that these dastardly figures wear breastplates the color of fire and brimstone. Yeah, we got time. The horses have the heads of lions, and out of their mouths proceed fire and smoke and brimstone. All these indicate fatal judgment throughout the course of history. We read this same kind of language all through the Old Testament. Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19. We see it against Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 29, in 2 Samuel chapter 22, in Isaiah chapter 34, and in Ezekiel chapter 38. Same language that's being used here in Revelation. Always is it referring specifically to punishment. In Revelation, the fire and brimstone are figurative, but they still suggest someone is getting punished severely. Like the tails on the scorpions, tail on the scorpion like locusts, in verse 10, these horse tails probably refer to a spiritual type torment, like we just previously talked about. We see the smoke of the fifth trumpet, now joined by fire at the sounding of the sixth. Because the power of the horses is in their mouths, kind of suggests the deception manifests itself through false teachings or the false prophets that are going to show up soon. And again, this parallels the sixth bowl in Revelation chapter 16 that's coming up later, where John sees a judgment of deception coming out of the mouth of the dragon and of the beast and of the false prophet. The power of the horses also comes from not only the mouth, but the tail. You see, their tails are kind of like the tails of a scorpion or the tail of a serpent. This multi-metaphor shows that the picture being painted is not literal, but it is symbolic. What we are to understand about these horse tails is who they are associated with. Okay? Because they're not literal tails, because they look like the tail of the scorpion in other parts of Revelation, and more specifically, the tail of a serpent. We should take notice. It is in Genesis that we are first introduced to this serpent, and this symbol is used throughout the entire Old Testament. Even when we get to places like Psalms and Isaiah and Job chapter 40, where it talks about the Leviathan. Sound like Porky Pig there for a second. I try so hard. Leviathan is actually not a good translation here. And it's more of a transliteration. Who remembers again? What are some of the places where we see transliterations in the Bible? Remember the word baptism was never a word until they decided they didn't want to translate it because they didn't want to offend the king, because if they did, they'd have to put down immersion, and he wasn't, and they'd probably cut their heads off. Nobody's going to get their heads cut off over this one, but they don't know how to translate it because the actual meaning of this word is something that's wrapped with scales. It's a scale-like thing. If you don't understand the entire story from beginning to end of the Bible and how God uses these symbols throughout the Old Testament to bring us to the New Testament, eventually to Revelation, then you see no need to think of it as being a symbol. But it is. It's just like the armor of Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17. We told that his head had a bronze helmet, but also that his armor was like scales. Think about it. Hint, hint. God's trying to tell us something. Therefore, the image John is portraying are not figurative for the destruction wrought by some future modern army, but instead all of these symbols symbolize the serpent, the destructive deceiver that leads to spiritual death. Like it says in Psalms chapter 58, which refers to the wicked, the one who speaks lies, the venom like that of a serpent. This metaphor illustrates the harm of false teachings. And in Proverbs chapter 23, the woe of delusion is compared to the bite of a serpent and the sting of a viper. Throughout the Bible, snakes, serpents, vipers, things with scales all over the place are used in various ways to symbolize not only Satan, but false teachings in general. And that is how we are they are used in Revelation and how we need to be able to understand them. These plagues serve as a warning and have a damning effect. Look at Revelation chapter 9 towards the end, verses 20 and 21. The rest of mankind who were not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hands, nor did they nor give up worshiping demons and idols, or gold and silver and bronze and stone and wood, which cannot see or hear or walk, nor did they repent of their murders or their sorceries or their sexual immoralities or their thefts. Kind of sums up what we've been saying. The theological purpose of all of this is to show how God is providing sufficient opportunities for spiritual reform. But, unfortunately, these warning signs do not always induce repentance. And that's part of the message of Revelation also. Too often, we only think of idolatry as bowing down to carved statues. But an idol is anything that replaces God. For Eve, the idol was a piece of fruit she had been told not to eat. But ultimately, the idol was herself. It was she that wished to make herself like God. Yes, Idolatry is also found in the forms of such things as self-worship, expressed through all kinds of things that, through an aggressive pursuit of goals in which God is excluded. Pride, ego, wealth, possessions, careers, comfort, social status, idolizing somebody that's rich and famous, self-indulgence, entertainment, political ambitions, or anything that will give what belongs to God away to meaningless entities. Like it says in Colossians chapter 3, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you. And then Paul goes on at that point to list many sins, each one of them he calls an idolatry. We talked about Friedrich Nietzsche just a little bit ago earlier in the lesson, the guy that claimed God was dead. He also said this: a noble type of person feels that he determines value. He does not need anyone's approval. He judges what is harmful to me is harmful to himself. He knows that he is the one. You get a pattern going on here? Okay? To him, if there was no God, if there really, really was no God, then everything has to come from us. That is the ultimate form of idolatry. In Genesis chapter 3, sin is to be understood as the rearranging of the existence around oneself. And in the end, the self attempts to be its own idolatrous creator, healer, and sustainer. So like Beale says in his book, which I've read pieces of, we become what we worship. Any comments or questions?
I missed the thing. Leviathan is not mentioned in Revelation 9, correct?
No.
Are you using that just as an illustration?
Illustration as to scales and that sort of thing throughout the Bible. Absolutely.
Okay.
It's actually used in quite a few different places, and we don't always pick up on it because we're reading the story with blinders, trying to figure out what the story is saying right there and then, instead of looking at it as it would be in the context of the entire Bible. Yeah, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say Leviathan in Revelation. I just used it as an example. Anything else?